What I want to do this morning is just briefly, morning my time, introduce you to how I, as a social scientist, think about the study of religion, and particularly introduce the notion of thinking about religion as a social practice, and explore a little bit about how that would deepen our understanding of how religion happens in the social world, and then bring that to the question of how religion has its effects in public life. So, click. Thank you. This may be a little awkward as we coordinate between my not having the PowerPoint myself, but what I want to start with is simply to remind us that much of the thinking about the relationship between religion and the larger public world has taken place through the lens of secularization theories. But those secularization theories have increasingly been brought into question, which is not to say that we don't have a lot of evidence of decline in attendance at religious institutions, people identifying with a particular religious tradition, the kind of cultural and even legal power that religious institutions have had in the past. But what we've increasingly realized is that the kinds of things we've measured and the things that have been explained by secularization theories may be particular to the West, and especially particular to institutional Christianity. Next slide. So one of the things that's happened over the last generation is that there's been a turn to the study of what's called lived religion. That's really paralleled new populations of scholars coming into the field who didn't necessarily come with the old assumptions, and have focused on new research areas. And that's really happened across disciplines. It started in history. It's very much rooted in an anthropological kind of approach, but all of the social sciences have really been affected by this, and it's resulted in a really rich body of literature that has given us a glimpse into the kinds of things that people are doing in their everyday lives. Next slide. But it's also had limitations. Because it sort of arose out of this impulse to say, well, wait a minute, it's not all about organized traditional religious organizations. The impulse has been to say, let's look at what individuals are doing, and let's look at the ways in which they are improvising, doing things that aren't necessarily organized by the traditional institutions. And that individual approach has tended sometimes to simply discount those organized religious bodies, as if it's not worth studying what churches and synagogues and mosques do. Other limitations are around the way the term lived religion has sometimes become a kind of evaluative term. That is, I'm doing real religion, lived religion, not mere institutional ritual. But the biggest problem, I think, is that lived religion was very good for describing, telling us some things about what's going on out there, but didn't have a really solid foundation in social theory. Next slide. So that key insight that we should pay attention to what people are actually doing leads me to say that one of the things we should be paying attention to, or that would be useful, is practice theory from sociology. Next slide. So when we think about social practices in social theory, what we're talking about is mutually recognized patterns of action that are guided by practical knowledge that is mostly habitual. That is, we simply recognize a particular kind of social situation, and we have a repertoire of tools that cognitively tell us what this is and how we should behave. That's the way much of social life is organized as practice theory understands it. Next slide. But one of the problems is that tends to leave out all of the ways in which things don't go as planned. That even though practices are mostly taken for granted and habitual, they also evolve. Sometimes they evolve through intentional agency. That is, somebody arrives on the scene and doesn't like the way things are going, and they intentionally do things differently. Sometimes the whole thing just gets messed up and people have to improvise. They're not quite sure what's going on here, and they have to figure out how to act. But one of the most common ways that things change and evolve is the fact that we don't exist in a single institutional field. We have practices in our little repertoire of cultural tools that come from all the different places where we interact. And when we enter a given field of action, we have all of that repertoire available to us. And sometimes a strategy from one place ends up being useful in another place in a way that changes the overall pattern of how people behave. Next slide. All of these ways of thinking about social practices often are rooted in Pierre Bourdieu's notion of habitus, but they still very much recognize the structural power of the institutions and cultures that shape those patterns of action. But as I've suggested, what they do more in the more contemporary practice theories is expand to recognize more of the possibility of human agents. You can still hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. I just got a message on my screen saying my mic was off, but I think that's because I've got two things running. Okay, so next slide. If we're going to think about religion as a social practice, then what we do is look for what people are actually doing that utilizes religious practical knowledge. That's sort of the key phrase. That religious practical knowledge is then both individual and collective. That is, we're bringing what we have as individuals, but it's collective in the sense that we don't invent that knowledge out of nothing. That religious practical knowledge comes from both inside and outside of organized religious institutions. And like all social practices, it can be either routine, habitual, or it could be innovative and improvised. Next slide. So just to sort of tease your imagination a little bit, I have several slides of people doing religious things, just to kind of get you thinking about the kinds of things we're talking about here. So I'm going to just say, click, click, click through. Here's a picture from Shanghai, a yoga class, picture from an African church, from a synagogue, from a mosque, from a temple in China, from an Orthodox church. Stop there. So thinking about all those different things, what makes those things religious? This is what gets really tricky. And I would say this is a place where not everybody agrees on what the definition should be. But here's how I approach it. I really take a cue from Alfred Schutz from phenomenology to talk about a more than ordinary spiritual dimension that's present in these practices. That is, in everyday life, we recognize some things as ordinary reality and other things as having some aspect of something that's more than ordinary, whether it's a dream or an imagination or whatever. That more than ordinary spiritual dimension to a social practice can be either something that we directly experience as we are engaged in the practice, or it may be something that's institutionally mediated. That is, we have a pattern that's out there that tells us that there is something going on here. Sometimes it's actually just kind of a residue. That is, we're engaged in something that once had that direct kind of spiritual dimension to it, but we don't necessarily directly experience it that way. A lot of people who approach this question approach it by saying, what we're really studying when we study religion is people oriented toward a supernatural person, a divine person. And that divine person is powerful, can intervene in human life. But I think if we limit ourselves to that kind of a definition of religion, we miss an awful lot of what's going on in the world that's not necessarily personified or experienced as powerful. So we're faced with two sort of basic kinds of strategies for how we identify what the things are that are religious. Sometimes we identify simply what people involved in it name as religious, emic strategies, as they're called. Or we try to identify analytical aspects of the practice that we as outside observers bring to the discussion. Next slide. So again, just to tease your imaginations a little bit, if you're thinking about where do we look for religious practices, next slide. You can just click through some here. We look in some of the predictable places, of course. Some places aren't necessarily in buildings. Some places are on bodies. Some places are out in the desert. Some places are in the cold water or at a local bar or out in the forest. Stop there. So if we broaden our imagination and look at all of these places where we might find people doing religion, what are we going to look at analytically? What's going on here? What do we pay attention to? Next slide. What I'm arguing is that religious social practices are multidimensional, and that part of what social practice theory and lived religion data have pointed to is this multidimensionality of religious experience. We may be focused on only one of these aspects, but paying attention to how they work as people are actually engaged in religious practice can often tell us a great deal about what's going on, how it came to be, what the structures are. If we look at, for instance, how people use the material world, the things, the buildings, the places, that may tell us a great deal about what's available to them, what's possible, what's structuring their activity, and so forth. And if we also then are aware of the feelings, the use of the body, the aesthetics, the moral judgments that are being brought to bear in these in the practices, we may learn a great deal about what's going on and how we're going to how we can understand religious practice and the presence of religion in social life more deeply. Next one. What I've been leading up to all this time is that paying attention to what people are actually doing is important, but we need to recognize that what they're doing is embedded in larger social structures. And those of you who are political scientists have probably been itching all this time to bring that into the conversation. So let's look at some of the ways in which we do that. All practices, not just religious practices, are structured by the kind of situation where they occur. We recognize that this is a school, or we recognize that it is a protest march, or we recognize that it is a religious ritual. There are situations in our societies, in our cultures, that are structured to elicit certain kinds of practices. But they're also structured by the kind of cultural traditions that we place ourselves in. So we may recognize a situation as being the kind of place that people like me engage in a particular set of activities. But that people like me is also structured around things like class and race and gender. That is, we recognize that as a woman or as a lower class person or as an African American, there are things that are expected of me, that are possible for me, that are not necessarily possible for other people. But what we also often miss as sociologists, and you don't miss as political scientists, is that there are laws and political structures and power structures that make it possible for people to engage in certain kinds of activities and not in other kinds of activities. Next slide. So let's think for a few minutes about how religious practices show up in politics and public life, and what kinds of what kinds of questions we might be asking about that. Next slide. One of the most important things to start with is that a practice can be political and religious at the same time. It doesn't make any sense or pay to simply say, oh, that's not really religion, that's politics, or that's not really politics because it's religious. Those practices can be both at the same time. The other thing that's important to remember is that this intersection of religious practice and political action happens across the political spectrum. Now, I've given you, you just lost me.
No, we can still hear you.
Okay, good. It's important to recognize that this happens across the political spectrum, that this intersection of religion and politics is not something that is exclusive to the left or the right. The two pictures I have given you here are on the top, an African American minister, William Barber, who is well known for championing causes of social justice. On the bottom, a picture from the January 6th, 2021 riots at the US Capitol, right wing, that were very infused with conservative religion. So keep those two things in mind. They can be both at the same time, and they can happen across the political spectrum. So, next slide. What is it that religious resources bring to this political action? Next slide. Religions have very powerful symbols. They have words, images, even colors that signal legitimacy and belonging and the power of a particular message in the public. Next one. They also tell stories. There are stories that are explicit, like doctrines and theologies that tell people how they're supposed to behave, but also the stories that appear in social media accounts, that happen in music, that are told implicitly in what happens in the streets. All of that storytelling, it can be really powerful. One of the other things that happens in the US, especially because of our voluntary way of organizing religion, is that when people come together in their religious communities, they learn to do things. They learn to organize. They learn how to speak in a large assembly. They learn how to communicate. They develop what some social theorists have called civic skills. And those skills are transferable into the actual political environment. Next slide. And it's not just those skills that make a difference. The kinds of organizational resources that religions that have organizational structures behind them bring into the public sphere are, in part, their history and tradition, the fact that they're recognized as legitimate actors in a society, the fact that they have leaders who can mobilize people, large groups of people, leaders who know how to lead, who have the skills to step into a political organization. Religious organizations also have money that they can put at the disposal of various kinds of public causes. They're often quite visible. They sit on prominent street corners or in prominent central locations so that they can be organizing spaces for people in public life. They have facilities, meeting rooms, communication equipment, all of that sort of thing that can be used in public life. And it's not just that there's a single organization that enters into public life, but often that single organizations, a church or a synagogue, is part of a larger coalition of organizations that is often multi-religious, often blends religious and secular concerns. So, for instance, here in the Boston area, we have something called the Boston Interfaith Organizing Coalition. And that Boston Interfaith organization brings together people across Muslim, Jewish, Christian, and secular concerns, unions, housing advocates, and so forth, and takes on issues like healthcare and housing, and brings those issues to the legislature, to other people in the public. So that ability to organize, to bring people together, is one of the important things that religious organizations bring into public life. In the US, for instance, there are something close to 400,000 local congregations. They're probably the single most prevalent local organization. And that means that no matter where you are, you're probably close to some kind of religious organization that, should it choose to do so, can bring its resources into the larger public sphere. Next slide. So, wrapping it up, to think about religion as a social practice, it's important to recognize that it can be anywhere, including inside a religious organization, but also in everyday social life. To think about the social practices that happen in all those places as multidimensional, that have those emotional and material and bodily and other aspects to them that we can study in order to think about how they are structured, and to recognize, in fact, that it is structured by the social context in which it occurs, and that it can be very powerful, either for good or for ill. So that's what I have to tell you, and I'm looking forward to what you have to ask me and to contribute as well.